This is Infantry Attacks by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Chapter 2, Combat in the Argonne, 1915. The company sector in the Charlotte Valley. Shortly before Christmas, I was released from the hospital, but my wound had not healed and hampered my walking. Service in a replacement battalion was distasteful, so I returned to my outfit. In the middle of January 1915, I joined the regiment in the western part of the Argonne. The bottomless road from Binarville to the regimental command post was indicative of conditions in the Argonne forest. I assumed command of the 9th Company, which needed a commander. A narrow corduroy footpath led forward from the regimental command post for a distance of about a half-mile. Occasionally, rifle bullets flew through the winter woods, and a few shells whistled overhead, forcing me to dive for cover in the deep clay communications trench. By the time I arrived at my company command post, my uniform had lost the telltale marks of the soldier returning from leave. I assumed command of about 200 bearded warriors and 440-yard company sector of the Frontline. A French reception committee greeted me with a concentration of whiz-bangs. The position consisted of a continuous trench reinforced by numerous breastworks. Several communications trenches led to the rear. Shortages in barbed wire prevented the erection of obstacles out in front. In general, the position was poorly developed, and surface water had kept the trench depth to 3 feet or less in some places. The dugouts, built to accommodate from 8 to 10 men, were of necessity equally shallow, and their roofs stuck out above the ground level, making them excellent targets. Their roofs were nothing more than a couple layers of thin logs, which at best were only splinter-proof. During the first hour of my command, a shell landed smack on one of them and severely wounded 9 men. My first order was that whenever artillery opened on us, all dugouts would be vacated and the men would take cover in the trench proper. I also issued orders that the dugout roofs would be strengthened so that they could at least withstand field artillery fire. This work began at dark. Several large oak trees near our position proved to be more dangerous to our safety. Whenever shells burst against them, they deflected the fragments straight out onto our trenches, so I ordered several of them chopped down. Stimulated by my new command, it was not long before I was my old self again. For a 23-year-old officer, there was no finer job than that of company commander. Winning the men's confidence required much of a commander. He must exercise care and caution, look after his men, live under the same hardships, and, above all, apply self-discipline. But once he had their confidence, his men will follow him through hell and high water. Each day brought plenty of work. We lacked boards, nails, clamps, roofing paper, wire, and tools. The headquarters dugout, which I shared with a platoon commander, was 4.5 feet high and contained a table and cot made of beech sticks tied together with wire and string. The walls were bare earth, and water trickled down constantly. During wet weather, water also leaked through the roof, which was made of 2 layers of oak trunks and a thin layer of earth. Every 4 hours, the dugout had to be bailed out to prevent flooding us out. We built fires only at night, and in damp winter weather were cold all the time. We could not see anything of the enemy position across from us because of the thick underbrush. The French were in better shape than we. They did not have to cut trees for lumber, for they received all the necessary materials from their supply dumps. Their location in extremely thick woods and our shortage in artillery ammunition limited the amount of harassing fire to which they were subjected. The enemy positions were some 300 yards away on the other side of the small valley. To hinder our work parties, the enemy frequently sprayed us with small arms fire. Unpleasant as this was, we disliked the whiz-bangs even more because of the short time interval between their discharge and impact. Whoever was caught in the open by one of these shells hit the dirt immediately if he hoped to avoid being hit by the shell fragments. Towards the end of January 1915, it rained and snowed on alternate days, and from January 23rd to 26th, the company went into reserve about 500 feet behind the front line. There, the dugouts were still worse, hostile artillery fire more troublesome, and daily losses equal to those up front. The company was used for service work, i.e., transport of materials, construction of dugouts, improving communication trenches, and laying out corduroy footpaths. We were glad when the time came for us to go forward once again. Morale was high, and officers and men alike were willing to endure any hardship in order to defend our native land and achieve the final victory. On January 27th, 2 of my men and I went on reconnaissance, which took us up a trench leading towards the enemy from the left of my company's sector. At this time, we were located in an old French position which had been taken on December 31st, 1914. After removing some obstacles in the trench, we proceeded cautiously, and about 40 yards down the trench line, we came upon some dead Frenchmen who had probably been lying unburied between the fronts since the attack. To the left of the trench was a small graveyard, and, at the end some 100 yards from our own position, a deserted medical aid station which, located in the deepest depression between the lines, was well dug in, well sheltered, and capable of holding 20 men. During the tour, we saw nothing of the enemy, although he delivered his usual harassing fire against our positions. Judging from the sound of his weapons, he was about 500 feet away on the other side of the valley. I decided to turn the dugout into an advanced strong point, and we started work that same afternoon. From this position, we could even hear the French talking across the way. I did not believe it wise to send any scouts forward, for they would have had too hard a time getting through the dense underbrush without being seen, and they would have been shot before obtaining any worthwhile information. Attack of January 29th, 1915. In order to pin down as many enemy forces as possible in the Argonne, small diversionary tactics were ordered for January 29th, 1915, and all regiments of the 27th Division were to participate. Following the blowing of a French mine shaft we had discovered, our regiment was to conduct a heavy raid in the 2nd Battalion sector on the right. While this raid was in progress, our artillery would open up and pin down the enemy in the 3rd Battalion sector in front of the 10th Company, forward on the right, and the 9th Company forward on the left. For this purpose, a howitzer battery from the 49th Field Artillery was made available, and it completed its registration on the 27th and 28th of January. Although the 10th Company would have to move from its position during the operation, the 9th Company was not to advance, but was to cut off all enemy attempts to escape on the flank. January 29th dawned cold with the ground frozen. At the start of the operation, I was up forward in our new strong point with the rifle squads. We were 100 yards ahead of our positions, and heard our own shells whistling overhead, some striking the trees, others landing to our rear. Then they blew the mine, and earth, sticks, and stones rained on the landscape. Hand grenade blasts from the right and intense small arms fire followed the explosion. A lone Frenchman ran up to our position and was shot dead. A few minutes later, the adjutant of the 3rd Battalion came up, reported that the attack on the right was going well, and said the battalion commander wished to know if the 9th Company cared to join in the fun. And we certainly would. Anything to get out of these trenches and this continually having to take cover. I realized that I could not move my company from our trenches in deployed formation, for enemy artillery and machine guns had our range, and any advance on our part would be reported by his treetop observers. To avoid this, I had my men crawl up a trench that extended to the front from the right of our position. After they reached the end of the trail, they deployed to the left, and after about 15 minutes the company was assembled in an area 100 yards in front of our position and on the slope leading down to the enemy. Carefully, we crawled through the bare underbrush towards the enemy, but before we could reach the hollow, he opened up on us with rifle and machine gun fire that stopped us cold. There was no cover, and we could hear the bullets slam into the frozen ground about us. Up ahead, a few oak trees sheltered a handful of my men. I could not locate the enemy, even with my binoculars. I knew that to remain where we were would cost us dearly in casualties, for even though the enemy fire was unaimed, it made up in volume what it lacked in direction. I racked my brains to find a way out of this mess without suffering heavy losses. It is in moments like this that the responsibility for the weal or woe of one's men weighs heavily on a commander's conscience. I had just decided to rush for the hollow 60 yards ahead, since it offered a little more cover than our present location, when we heard the attack signal far off to the right. My bugler was right beside me, and I had him sound the charge. In spite of the undiminished volume of fire directed at us, the 9th Company jumped up and, cheering lustily, dashed forward. We crossed the hollow and reached the French wire entanglements, only to see the enemy hurriedly abandon his strong position. Red trousers flashed through the underbrush, and blue coattails were flying. Totally oblivious of the booty left behind in the abandoned positions, we rushed after them. By sticking close to the enemy's heels, we managed to smash through 2 other defensive lines which had been well provided with wire entanglements. At each position, the enemy ran before we got to him. As proof of the meager resistance, we had no losses whatsoever. And here we have sketch 11 demonstrating the course of their operations. So you can see the first charge that they made, which appears to go over a series of trenches, 3 separate trench lines, and what looks to be a variety of barbed wire entanglements. And then they have an area of dead ground with no cover, before a secondary French trench line, which appears to have, yes, barbed wire in front of it. And then it looks, although there's no legend for this map, regrettably, there is what looks to be a fence line cutting across, headed north-south, and then the trenches appear to be directed east-west. In any case, the German troops charge over those 3 trench lines. The French disperse headed east and west, and then they basically fall back to their second line of defense. The part of the force heads to the, I want to say east, yes, part of the force heads east to try and attack the French as they are in the retreat, and another portion pursues the French that are headed west. However, the portion that heads west decides to abandon the chase, it looks like, and proceeds due south in order to pass over the French trench line. Meanwhile, portions of the French force that was fleeing circle back and head southwest, and then proceed to attack on the other side of the French trench line that has been overrun, whereas the other force does the same, some sort of a pincer maneuver. And then the scale for this map is marked as being 400 meters to an inch. And here we are. Sketch 11, Attack against the Central Position, January 29th, 1915. We continue. We passed over a height, and the woods began to thin out. We could see the enemy running before us in a dense mass, so we pounded after him, shooting as we went. Some of the company cleaned out the dugouts, and the rest of us kept going until we reached the edge of the woods, 600 yards west of Fontaine-aux-Chamettes. At this point, we were half a mile south of our initial position. Here, the terrain sloped down again, and the fleeing enemy had disappeared in low undergrowth. We had lost contact on both flanks and the rear, and on both sides we heard the sounds of a bitter struggle. I assembled the company and occupied the edge of the woods west of Fontaine-aux-Chamettes, and then tried to re-establish contact with the adjacent units. To the accompaniment of general laughter, a soldier brought some articles of feminine-wearing apparel out of a dugout. Interesting. So I guess the French troops had hookers in there or something, and they all fled in a hurry. Anyway, continuing. A reserve company arrived, and after giving it the job of re-establishing contact, we moved off downhill to the southwest through the light shrubbery of this sector, where the terrain had been largely cleared of trees. My unit advanced in a column behind strong security elements. We had just crossed a hollow when strong fire from our left forced us to the ground, but the enemy could not be seen. In order to maintain our impetus, we moved off to the west, bypassing the hostile fire, and then resumed our advance to the south through open woods. At the upper edge of these woods, we suddenly came upon a barbed wire entanglement, the extent of which we had never seen before. Some 100 yards in depth, it extended on both flanks as far as the eye could see. The French had also cleared the entire forest in this salient. On the far side of this obstacle, which was situated on a gently sloping rise, I could see 3 of my men signaling. One was Private Matt, the youngest of our war volunteers, so it was clear that the enemy had not as yet occupied this strong position. It struck me that to seize and hold this position until the reserves came up would be a worthwhile and important undertaking. I tried to move on down the narrow path that led through the wire, but enemy fire from the left forced me to hit the dirt. The enemy was nearly a quarter of a mile away, and certainly could not see me because of the density of the wire. Yet ricochets rang all around me as I crawled through the position on all fours. I ordered the company to follow me in single file, but the commander of my leading platoon lost his nerve and did nothing, and the rest of the company imitated him and lay down behind the wire. Shouting and waving at them proved useless. This position, constructed like a fortification, could not be held by 3 men alone, and the company had to follow. By exploring to the west, I found another passage through the obstacle and crept back to the company, where I informed my first platoon leader that he could either obey my orders or be shot on the spot. He elected to carry out the former, and in spite of intense small arms fire from the left, we all crept through the obstacle and reached the hostile position. To secure the position, I had my company deploy in a semicircle and dig in. The position was called Central, and was constructed in accordance with the most recent design. It was part of the general defensive system which ran through the Argonne, and consisted of strong blockhouses spaced some 60 yards apart, from which the French could cover their extensive wire entanglements with flanking as well as frontal machine gun fire. A line of breastworks connected the individual blockhouses, and this wall was so high that fire from the fire step could reach any part of the wire entanglements within range. The wall was separated from the entanglement by a ditch some 15 feet wide, which was water-filled and, at this time of year, frozen over. Deep dugouts were provided behind the wall, and a narrow road ran along some 11 yards from it. The height of the wall was such as to offer concealment to any vehicles using the road. From the left, we were subjected to considerable small arms fire, while over on the right, the installations appeared to be unoccupied. At around 0900 hours, I sent the following written message to my battalion. 9th Company has occupied some strong French earthworks located 1 mile south of our line of departure. We hold a section running through the forest. Request immediate support and a resupply in machine gun ammunition and hand grenades. Meanwhile, the troops were trying to make an impression on the frozen ground with their spades, but it was only by using the few available picks and mattocks that we made any real progress. We had been working for some 30 minutes when the left outpost reported that the enemy was retiring through the wire some 600 yards to the east in closed column. I had one platoon open fire. Part of the enemy headed for cover, but others who were still north of the obstacle turned further to the east and apparently reached the covered road behind the works. For very shortly after our opening fire, we were attacked from that direction. Since our digging was producing little worth mentioning, I looked for another place to locate the company. 200 yards to the right, I found a bend in the enemy position which would serve as an excellent place to hold if we were to maintain our bridgehead in the enemy works. The company fought its way to the new position, called Laborde, where we quickly improvised defenses with the many tree trunks scattered about. From here, we opened a lively and independent fire against the enemy force on the right and brought him to a halt about 300 yards away. We chose to dig in at that point, and shortly thereafter, his fire slackened and then ceased. It's written choose, it should be chose. That appears to be a typo in the previous sentence. Continuing. My bridgehead included 4 blockhouses, my company being deployed in a semicircle with a platoon of 50 men in concealed reserve between the wire entanglements and the position. Here, another narrow zigzag passage led through the wire field. Time passed, and we began getting anxious about our reinforcements and supplies. Suddenly, reports from the right indicated that more French were retreating through the wire some 50 yards from us. The platoon leader wanted to know if he should open fire. What else was there for us to do? We were about to get into a nasty scrap, and there was no use allowing the French to start it free from casualties. If we fired at once, then the French would turn to the west and get into the position through the next passage. It was also possible that they might get across our line of communication and so surround us. I opened fire. And here we have sketch 12. Attack against the central position. January 29th, 1915. View from the south, listed as point A. 3rd French position, listed as point... Oh, wait a second. Viewed from the south. A is the 3rd French position. B is the 9th Company exploits the breakthrough and penetrates as far as the central position. Point C. 9th Company holds portions of central and Laborde positions. Point D. Attack prior to breaking off combat. Point E. The route of withdrawal. So yeah, as can be seen there, the Germans advance from point A through to point B, engage the French. They break off and head west, while the French break off and head east. Both circle around, and yeah, the Germans appear to cross another French trench line. And at point C, they dig in and then retreat to the west, occupying some earthworks, where they engage another section of French that had been following them from the original line that they had broken through at. And they are in dire straits there, and it's very likely that they are going to be encircled and annihilated if they're not careful. In any case, from the high French breastworks, rapid fire struck the nearby enemy, and a bitter struggle developed, with the French fighting bravely. Fortunately, most of the new enemy, estimated as 1 battalion, turned off to the west, traversed the wire entanglements 350 yards away, and moved towards us from the west on a broad front. The ring about the 9th Company closed, leaving but one narrow path through the wire to connect us with the battalion. Even that lifeline was swept by enemy fire from the east and west. On the right, our heavy fire kept the enemy pinned to the ground, but the enemy on the left had made progress and was getting dangerously close. Ammunition was getting scarce, and I stripped the reserve platoon of most of its equipment. I decreased the rate of fire in order to conserve ammunition as long as possible. But the enemy on the west kept crawling closer. What was I to do once my ammunition was exhausted? I still hoped for help from the rest of the battalion. Minutes passed like eternities. A fierce battle raged about the blockhouse on the extreme right, and we expended our last grenades in its defense. A few minutes later, at around 10:30, that's 10:30 a.m., a French assault squad succeeded in taking it and used its embrasures to pour rifle and machine gun fire into our barracks. This report reached me at the same moment that a battalion order was shouted across the entanglement by a runner. Battalion is in a position half a mile to the north and is digging in. Rommel's company to withdrawal. Support not possible. Again, the front line was calling for ammunition, and we had enough for only 10 more minutes of battle. Now for a decision. Should we break off the engagement and run back through the narrow passage in the wire entanglements under a heavy crossfire? Such a maneuver would, at minimum, cost 50% in casualties. The alternative was to fire the rest of our ammunition and then surrender. The last resort was out. I had one other line of action, namely, to attack the enemy, disorganize him, and then withdraw. Therein lay our only possible path to salvation. To be sure, the enemy was far superior in numbers, but French infantry had yet to withstand an attack by my riflemen. If the enemy in the west were thrown back, we would have a chance of getting through the obstacle and only have to worry about the fire of the more distant enemy on the east. Speed was the keynote of success, for we had to be gone before those we had attacked could recover from their surprise. I lost no time in issuing my attack order. Everyone knew how desperate the situation was, and all were resolved to do their utmost. The reserve platoon drove to the right, recapturing the lost blockhouse and carrying the whole line along with its impetus. The enemy broke and ran, with the French running away to the west. The proper moment to break off combat had come. We hurried eastwards and negotiated the wire entanglement in single file as fast as possible. The French on the eastward opened up on us, but a running target was not too profitable at a range of 300 yards. Even so, they got a few hits in. By the time the enemy on the west had recovered and returned to the attack, I had the bulk of my outfit on the safe side of the wire. Aside from 5 severely wounded men who could not be carried for long, the company reached the battalion position without further incident. The battalion, with my company on the left, was established in the dense forest directly south of the 3 occupied French positions. The 1st Battalion was having trouble and was out of direct contact with our left, but by means of liaison squads, we managed to keep in touch with their right. My company dug in some 100 yards from the forest edge. Digging in the frozen ground was no fun. So far, the French artillery had devoted its entire attention to our old position and to the rear areas, and during the attack we had been spared its attention, probably due to poor infantry-artillery liaison. This had been remedied now, and we were subjected to a very heavy volume of retaliatory fire, which interfered with our digging since the forward edge of the forest received particular attention. I prepared a complete report of the morning's action on a message form and attached a sketch of the central and Laborde positions. Late in the afternoon of January 29th, following a heavy artillery preparation, the enemy counterattacked. Masses of fresh troops stormed through the underbrush, urged on by bugle calls and shouted commands. Masses of fresh troops stormed through the underbrush, urged on by bugle calls and shouted commands, only to be met by our small arms fire. They fell, sought cover, and returned our fire. Here and there, a small group tried to work its way closer, but in vain. Our defensive fire smothered the attack with heavy losses, and large numbers of dead and wounded lay close to our lines. Under cover of darkness, the French withdrew to the edge of the forest 100 yards away and dug in. The infantry fire died down, and we too began to dig, for our own trenches were only 20 inches deep. That's less than a foot and a half. Actually, almost exactly. 18 inches would be a foot and a half. That's 2 inches over a foot and a half. That's like a foot 8. 1 foot 8. That's not going to do anything. Under cover of darkness, the French withdrew to the edge of the forest 100 yards away and dug in. The infantry fire died down, and we too began to dig, for our own trenches were only 20 inches deep. Before we could get much deeper, the French artillery shells began dropping among us. These were steel-cased rounds of American design, which were bursting all around and sending jagged steel fragments shrieking through the winter night to snap off good-sized trees as if they were matchsticks. Our positions offered inadequate cover for the harassing fire, which, with few breaks, kept up all night. Wrapped in overcoats, shelter halves, and blankets, we lay shivering in the shallow trench. I could hear the men jump as each new concentration hit near us. During the night, we lost 12 men, which was a heavier loss than we had sustained during the entire attack. No rations could be brought up. At dawn, the hostile artillery activity slackened, and we began to work on deepening our positions, but we were not allowed much time. At 0800 hours, artillery fire forced us to quit, and the fire was followed by a strong infantry attack, which we threw back with little difficulty. The same fate met succeeding attacks, and by afternoon our position was deep enough so that we could stop worrying about the effects of artillery fire. We had no communication trenches to the rear, so we had to wait until dark for our first hot meal. Observations. The attack on January 29, 1915, showed the superiority of the German infantry. The attack of the 9th Company was no surprise, and it is difficult to understand why the French infantry lost its nerve and abandoned a well-prepared defensive position lavishly protected by wire 3 lines deep and well-studded with machine gun emplacements. The enemy knew the attack was coming and had tried to stop it by means of heavy interdiction fire. The fact that we were able to resort to offensive action and break from the encircled Laborde position is ample proof of the combat capabilities of our troops. It was unfortunate that neither the battalion nor the regiment was able to exploit the 9th Company's success. With 3 battalions in line, inadequate reserves were available. Shortages in small arms ammunition and hand grenades increased our troubles in the defense of Laborde. Several things happened simultaneously to render our situation most critical. First, the enemy seized the blockhouse on the extreme right. Second, we received the battalion order to withdraw. And third, we were short of ammunition. Finally, our way back through the wire was swept by enemy fire. Any decision other than the one made would have resulted in terrific casualties, if not total annihilation. Above all, it was impossible to wait for darkness, for the last round would have been fired well before 1100 hours. That's 11 a.m. Well before noon, about an hour before noon. Attacking the weaker enemy force on the east would not have paid dividends, for the more aggressive attack came from the west, and attacking to the east would have given the western force an excellent opportunity to strike us in the rear. Breaking off the fighting in Laborde confirms the statement in the Field Service Regulations, quote, "Breaking off combat is most easily accomplished after a successful offensive maneuver," end quote. In making our hasty preparations for the attack, we gave no thought to carrying heavy entrenching tools. The solidly frozen ground made our light tools almost useless. Even in the attack, the spade is as important as the rifle. Although there was a better field of fire from the edge of the forest, the new position was 100 yards inside the woods. We had no intentions of exposing the troops to a repeat performance of the Defoy Woods bombardment, and still had a field of fire good enough to repel several French infantry attacks with heavy losses. The losses from hostile artillery fire during the night of January 29th through 30th were so heavy because the troops did not dig in to a proper depth. Before Central and Bagatelle, our new positions were an improvement. We were located at a higher elevation, and surface water no longer bothered us. Moreover, the ground was easier to work. Shell-proof dugouts and shelters 13 to 20 feet underground had been captured in the attack, and these were impervious to the French artillery. I shared sleeping quarters in a dugout with an officer of the Uhlans, like myself a company commander, which we could only reach by crawling on all fours. By day, we suffered bitterly from the cold, since we dared not light a fire. The merest wisp of smoke was enough to bring heavy, harassing fire from the French. 10-day reliefs were established front line. Reserve, position, and rest camp alternated with one another. Thanks to the good positions and dugouts, frontline losses were slight, although the French artillery increased the volume of its harassing fire from day to day. Their batteries apparently had plenty of ammunition, in contrast to ours, which were so short that we only opened fire on occasion. I heard that the 5 severely wounded men we had left behind to be taken prisoner on January 29th were getting along well, and a few weeks later I was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for that operation. I was the first lieutenant of the regiment to get this decoration. The next 3 months were spent in rectifying our lines in conjunction with our neighbors. The 120th Infantry on the right got a bit further forward than we did on January 29th. The 123rd Grenadier Regiment on the left worked itself forward towards Cimetrière, which adjoined Central on the east. Again and again, sap trenches were driven forward and then interconnected. In this way, the front line was moved nearer the French, and we finally reached the French wire entanglements in front of their main position. Our work was hindered by artillery and trench mortars, the latter appearing for the first time, and many a soldier was hit in the sap trenches. The communication trenches and passages to the rear, the command post, and the supply dumps were constantly subject to French harassing fire. When the company moved back to the rest camp, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Usually, during such reliefs, we also had the sad duty of burying our fallen comrades. In time, the reliefs became fewer. Losses in the forward line increased, and the quiet forest burial ground became much more extensive. From the beginning of May, the enemy raked our foremost trenches in the central sector with light and medium-thinned mortar bombs. The quiet sound of their discharge was all too familiar to veterans of the Argonne. Although weaker than other battle sounds, it was enough to wake us from the deepest sleep and send us scurrying out of the dugouts post-haste. In daytime, the missiles could be seen flying through the air, and we had ample time to duck. At night, it was best to avoid the menaced area entirely. On the other hand, nobody bothered to wake up and leave the dugouts during harassing fire by the artillery. In spite of daily casualties and the nerve-wracking strain of combat, morale remained high, everyone performing duties in an amazingly matter-of-fact manner. We even found ourselves becoming attached to this blood-drenched corner of the Argonne. The hardest thing was saying goodbye to buddies who were carried back dead or severely wounded. Never to be forgotten is the soldier whose leg had been blown off by a mortar round. On a bloody shelter half, they carried him past us down the narrow trench at sunset. I found it difficult to express my feelings at seeing this fine young soldier leave us this way, and I could only press his hand to encourage him. But he said, "Lieutenant, this is not so bad. I shall soon be back with the company, even if I have to use a wooden leg. I swear it." The brave lad never saw the sun rise again, for he died on the way to the hospital. This conception of duty was characteristic of the spirit of my company. In early May, we received our first delivery of pit props, which we used to construct well-braced 1- and 2-man dugouts sunk into the forward walls of the trenches. By this arrangement, we could quarter the sentry reliefs at the sentry posts. The front line was now so close to the main enemy works that the French artillery could not fire on us without engaging its own people. It transferred and increased its activity against the rear units, the supply routes, the reserve positions, command posts, and encampments. About this time, a senior first lieutenant who had not yet had field duty took over the 9th Company. The regimental commander wished to transfer me to a different company, but I declined and remained with the men whom I had previously commanded. For 10 days during the middle of May, the 9th Company was attached to the 67th Infantry, which was located in the middle of the Argonne near Bagatelle to the west of the 123rd Grenadiers. This aggressive unit was badly depleted as a result of its many fights in the campaign. A different sort of trench warfare prevailed here. Less value was put on positions offering shelter from artillery and mortar fire. The whole battle was conducted at grenade distance from shallow depressions and from behind low sandbag walls. At Bagatelle, there were few indications that the Argonne was a dense forest, for the French artillery fire had cleared the trees thoroughly, and for miles all that remained visible were stumps. While the junior commanders were making their reconnaissance prior to taking over, a brief but violent hand grenade fight broke out on a wide front, and before it was over, we had suffered severe casualties. This was a sample of what was in store, and we made the relief with mixed emotions. As was our custom, we deepened the trench at once and built dugouts for ourselves. Sudden and violent bursts of French artillery and mortar fire, accompanied by hand grenade fights all along the line, kept us from having dull moments. In the warm weather, the frightful stench of corpses wafted into the position. Many Frenchmen and many French dead lay still in front of and between our positions, but we could not bury them because of the strong enemy fire. The nights were really exciting. Hand grenade battles went on for hours along a broad front and became so confused that we never knew whether or not the enemy had broken through at some place or had worked his way behind our front line. Added to this, various enemy batteries chimed in from the flanks. This was repeated several times nightly, and we soon found it a strain on our nerves. The platoon command post that I had inherited from my predecessors lay to the left rear of my platoon's sector. At the level of the bottom of the trench, about 6 feet below the ground, there was a narrow vertical shaft in the forward wall. This shaft was just wide enough to permit one man to lower himself through it. Another 6 feet, that is, 12 feet under the surface, it opened on a horizontal tunnel the size of a large coffin. The floor was made up of cork slabs, and small niches had been cut into the wall to provide storage for rations and laundry and sundry other belongings. The walls and roof were devoid of bracing, and while the clayey soil was holding, I knew that anyone caught there by a shell exploding near the entrance was certain to be buried alive. As soon as shells struck in the vicinity, I got out of my hole and joined my platoon. Anyway, it was better to stay up forward for the hand grenade fight, which kept us on our feet half the night. The heat was unbearable during those days. One day, Ensign Morick, an especially fine soldier, visited me. I was down in my dugout, and we had to talk to each other through the shaft because there was not room for two in my warren. I told Morick I was convinced that we were not safe from the damned flies even when we were 12 feet underground. Morick said it was no wonder, since the edge of the trench was simply black with them. He got a pick and started to dig there, and at the first swing, the half-decayed, blackened arm of a Frenchman came to light. We threw chloride of lime and earth on it, and left the dead man in peace. We managed to weather the 10 days, and on our return to our regimental sector, we were shoved back into the front line. We found that every effort had been made to render trench warfare more unpleasant, for they had added mining to an increased volume of artillery and trench mortar fire. The opposing outposts were only a few yards apart in half-covered sap trenches, heavily reinforced with wire, and the night was full of lively hand grenade battles, which from time to time brought the entire garrison to its feet. Each side tried to destroy the other's advanced tunnels and positions, and hardly a day passed without an explosion. One day, the French succeeded in cutting one of our sap trenches, which had 10 men of our company working in it. We got them out, but it took several hours of hard fighting and digging, for several were completely buried. Poor sods, buried alive. Our attempts to capture the nearby French sentry posts usually ended in considerable losses. These posts and the sections of trench leading to them were completely enclosed with barbed wire. At the slightest noise, the French in the blockhouses would sweep the obstacles with machine gun fire. These conditions soon became exasperating, and we hoped to remedy them by storming Central. Attack on Central. Following a 3.5-hour artillery and trench mortar preparation, we were to seize the French strongpoints of Laborde, Central, Cimetière, I'm butchering that name, pardon me, and Bagatelle. The enemy had been working on these positions since October of 1914. For weeks, the regiment had been making basic preparations for this attack. Close behind the front line in shell-proof emplacements, medium and heavy mortars had been sighted. Day and night, reserve companies brought up supplies, dismantled mortars, and ammunition through the narrow communication trenches. The French harassing fire had increased in the violence, and many a carrying party had been hit. Towards the end of June, and after a few days in the rest camp, the 9th Company headed back into the line. We were amazed to see large numbers of medium and heavy artillery emplaced and camouflaged in the vicinity of Binarville. It was pleasant to note that adequate ammunition seemed to be available this time. This time, we moved up into position in the best of spirits. The regiment prepared detailed plans for the 5 assault companies. During the preparation, my platoon remained in reserve about 2/3 of a mile north of Central. Shortly before the jump-off, we were to move up behind the line of departure, follow the assault echelon closely, and keep supplied with grenades, ammunition, and entrenching equipment. At 0:15 hours, that's 5:15 a.m., on July 30th, the artillery opened up with everything it had, including 8.3-inch and 12-inch mortars. The effect of the shells was unbelievable. Earthen geysers shot into the air. Craters suddenly appeared before us. The strong French earthworks was smashed apart as if hit by gigantic trip hammers. Men, timber, roots, obstacles and sandbags flew into the air. We wondered how the enemy felt, for we had never seen such a massing of heavy fire before. 1 hour before the assault, the medium and heavy mortars opened up on the blockhouses, wire entanglements, and breastworks. The French massed their artillery fire to break up the assault, but their efforts were futile. Our forward line was thinly held and was too close to the main hostile position. The French guns plowed up the dirt further to the rear. One round dug in 100 yards ahead of me and tossed the mortal remains of a Frenchman who was killed in January up into the trees. I kept looking at my watch. We had 15 minutes to go. A blue-gray pall of smoke from the bombardment obscured vision as both sides increased their volume of fire. The communication trench assigned us was exposed to strong hostile fire, and I decided to deviate from my orders in displacing to the side for about 100 yards. We ran for our lives across the open stretch of ground and found shelter down in the hollow. Then, through the communication trench, we rushed into the front line with French standing barrages we rushed into the front line with French standing barrages bursting all around. The storm troops were lying side by side, and across from us the last gun and mortar shells were bursting. 08:45 hours, and our assault moved forward over a wide front. French machine guns poured out their fire. The men jumped around craters, over obstacles, and into the enemy position. The assault echelon of our company was hit by machine gun fire from the right, and a few fell. But the bulk rushed on, disappearing in craters and behind embankments. My platoon followed. Each man had his load, either several spades or else sacks filled with grenades or ammunition. The French machine gun to the right was still hammering away. We passed through its field of fire and climbed over the wall on which the 9th Company stood on January 29th. The position was a mass of rubble. Dead and wounded Frenchmen lay scattered through the tangle of revetments, timbers, and uprooted trees. These revetments had cost many a Frenchman his life. To the right and in front of us, hand grenade fights were in progress, and from rearward positions, French machine guns swept the battlefield in all directions and forced us to take cover. The sun was hot. Stooped over, we moved off to the left of them, hard on the heels of our company's assault echelon, pressed on a communications trench leading to the second position. Here we have sketch 13, the storming of Central Ill, or is that 2? I can't tell here. Try and zoom in on it. Yeah, here, the storming of Central 2, 30th of January, 1915. So we can see the German troops advancing on the French trench line. They breach the first line and they breach the second line. The 9th Company can be seen engaging with some of the French, a good many of whom have retreated to the I'd say, southwestern corner of this map, and the 9th Company can be seen engaging them as the 1st Battalion presses the march forward in order to try and outflank them. Continuing here. Our artillery had shifted its fire to the 2nd French line, in brackets Central 2, located 160 yards to the south, which was to be captured on July 1st only after renewed artillery and mortar bombardment. The assault echelons of the regiment, not engaged in mopping up Central 1, were pushing on towards Central 2. About 30 yards ahead of us, a violent hand grenade fight raged, and beyond that we could see the outlines of Central 2 some 90 yards distant. French machine gun fire made it impossible to move outside the communication trench, and our own assault group up forward seemed to be stalled. Its young leader, Ensign Morick, was lying in the trench, severely wounded with a bullet in his pelvis. I wanted to carry him back, but he said that we should not worry about him. Stretcher bearers took charge. One last hand clasp, and I assured the command up front. The ensign died the next day in the hospital. We engaged the garrison of Central 2. Our own artillery had ceased firing. A few salvos of hand grenades followed by a charge, and we were in Central 2. Part of the garrison ran down the trench, others fled across the open fields, and the rest surrendered. While part of the outfit worked to widen the breach, the bulk of the assault force kept pressing south. We moved through a 10-foot communications trench and had the luck to surprise and capture a French battalion commander with his entire staff, who offered no resistance. About 100 yards down the line, the trench opened on a large clearing. In front of us, the terrain dropped sharply down to the valley at Vienne-le-Château, which was obscured from view by the woods. We lost contact on both flanks and to the right. On the edge of the forest, some 200 yards away, we saw a considerable number of enemy. We opened fire, and after a sharp firefight, they withdrew into the woods. While this was going on, I established contact on my left with elements of the 1st Battalion who had advanced this far, and I reorganized my command, which by this time included elements of all units of the 3rd Battalion, and deployed it to a defensive position some 350 yards south of Central 2. Because of our exposed right flank, and since we still heard the sounds of bitter fighting behind us, I felt it inadvisable to continue the advance to the south. Also, the memory of January 29th, when I went so far out front that I lost all support, was still fresh in my mind. And here we have a diagram, or sketch rather, marked as a French battalion command post in Central 2. So you can see that the trench is there, and in the foreground you have what appears to be some sort of cave thing that's been carved into the side of the trench, which is evidently the command post itself. And you have a variety of trees that have shed all of their leaves hanging above the trench line. And in the distance you can kind of see what looks to be various trees that have been shot and fallen over. But still, it does give a somewhat accurate depiction of what the trenches themselves would have looked like that they were currently occupying at this point in time. A reconnaissance detachment reported that the unit to our right had been unable to clear Central 1. This meant we must prepare blocking positions to protect our newly won positions against attacks from the west. To bolster the defenses, I put my best veterans in line, and was glad of it, for during the next few hours the French launched a series of violent counterattacks to regain their lost positions. I kept the battalion commander informed of developments. On the left, some companies of the 1st Battalion had advanced down the valley as far as the Hoyette Gorge. Combat outposts reported strong enemy forces in the woods on the slope 330 yards ahead. I discussed the situation with Captain Ulrecht, the commander of the 1st Battalion, and he decided to have the 1st Battalion dig in on the left of the 9th Company. We wasted no time in getting to work. I kept one platoon in reserve and used it to bring up ammunition and hand grenades and for work on the flank position in Central 2. French reconnaissance detachments were probing our front, but we drove them off without trouble. Digging was easy, and in short time our trench was better than 3 feet deep. Since the start of the attack, the French artillery had been rather quiet, but now it opened up on Central 2 with every weapon at its disposal. The French apparently believed we occupied the place in force, for their ammunition expenditure was very heavy. The net result was to smash up their own position and cut our communications to the rear. Supplies ran a gauntlet of fire, and one lone wire was soon knocked out. We did succeed in emplacing one heavy machine gun platoon in the company sector. By evening, our trench was 5 feet deep, and the French artillery was still falling behind us. Suddenly, bugle calls rang out in the woods, and the enemy, in his usual mass formation, rushed us from the woods an eighth of a mile away. However, our fire soon drove him to earth. There was a slight fold in the ground, and as a result, we picked up targets from our trench only when they came to within 90 yards of our position. Perhaps a position further back, near Central 2, would have been better. We certainly would have had a good field of fire from there, but on the other hand, the French artillery would have punished us severely. The French attacked with vigor, and hand grenade fights continued all over the place even after it became quite dark. Our supply of grenades was limited, and we did most of our fighting with the rifle and heavy machine gun. The night was black, and smoke from bursting grenades reduced the effectiveness of our rocket flares. Grenades burst all around us, for the enemy was within 50 yards of our position. The fight waxed and waned all night, and we beat off all attacks. At daybreak, we made out a sandbag wall some 50 yards away, and all sounds indicated that the enemy were busily engaged in digging in behind their improvised shelter. The French infantry kept us on the go during the night, and their artillery then took over the morning shift. Fortunately, the bulk of artillery fire landed in Central 1 and 2, with but a small fraction striking close to our position, and a hit in the front line was a great rarity. So we felt comparatively secure and did not envy the carrying parties who had to move rations and other supplies up through the shell-plastered communication trenches. We spent the succeeding days in improving the position. The trench was soon 6 feet deep. We constructed small wood-lined dugouts, installed armored shields, and sandbagged firing points. The front line losses from artillery fire were few, but we lost men daily in the shell-torn communication trenches leading to the rear. The strong artillery concentrated from the June 30th offensive moved to another front, and our weak organic artillery lacked sufficient ammunition to give us worthwhile support. However, an artillery observer was always up front, and we in the infantry appreciated this very much. During the early days of July, the enemy began to wreck our trenches daily with fin-stabilized mortar fire delivered from positions that permitted a certain degree of inflating fire. These mortars are of a simple construction and provided but little lateral dispersion. Consequently, he obtained a high percentage of direct hits, and it was not always possible to evacuate the dangerous localities in time, so as to avoid losses. Our casualties were considerable, several men being killed by the blast effect of the 100-pound projectiles alone. During July, I began a 5-week assignment as substitute for the commander of the 10th Company in a sector where relief was furnished by the 4th and 5th Companies. We company commanders worked on a unified plan for construction of shell-proof, multi-entrance dugouts 26 feet underground. The work went on day and night, with several parties working on the dugout from different directions. The officers pitched in, and we found that sharing the work helped morale. Frequently, an entire position was flattened by artillery inside of an hour. When this happened, we saw our lightly timbered dugouts collapse like cardboard boxes. Fortunately, the French bombardment followed a rigid plan. Usually, they began on the left and traversed their way right. To remain under heavy fire proved too expensive, so whenever it started, I evacuated the trench and waited until they moved their fire laterally or shifted it to our rear areas. If French infantry had followed their artillery and attacked us, then we would have thrown them out with a counterattack. This did not bother us because, man to man, we felt ourselves to be superior. The Central 1 location repeated itself, and we began to drive short saps and mine tunnels towards the enemy position. Early in August, my company relieved the 12th Company in the Martin sector. This outfit needed relief following heavy losses sustained the day before in an attack made after the blowing of a mine tunnel. The relief was made at dawn without incident, but we were hardly in a position before the French artillery opened up, and we spent some intense moments flat on our faces with the enemy dead lying all around us. When the fire slackened and died down, we got our spades working and began deepening the position. Once the trench was 8 feet deep and had numerous small dugouts set into the forward wall, we stopped worrying about the French field artillery. Anyway, I wanted to come out with the same number with which I went in. The heavy spade work paid, and 2 days later, in spite of much harassing fire, we left the position with only minor casualties. Near the middle of August, I turned over the company to my relief and took a 14-day leave, my first of the war. Observations. On June 30th, in order to deceive the enemy as to the time of attack, there were numerous breaks in the 3.5-hour artillery and mortar preparation. In spite of very heavy fire, the hostile position was not completely destroyed, and a few machine gun nests still put up resistance during the attack. The great offensive power of the German infantry was again evident. It did not stop on the initial objective, but went ahead and seized the next French positions. The speed of attack was such that a battalion commander and his staff were surprised and taken prisoner. The switch from successful offense to defense was made rapidly, and since the French were thoroughly familiar with their old positions, we avoided using them. Detailing of carrying parties for ammunition and tool supply was excellent foresight, for French retaliatory fire prevented the resupply of the assault echelon for several hours, and also interrupted telephone communications. On July 1st, rifle and machine gun fire played a dominant role in the repulse of French counterattacks launched against us from the nearby woods. Before daybreak, and using a sandbag wall as cover, the French infantry dug in some 50 yards in front of our line. Apparently, a part of these sandbags had been taken along during their attack or had been brought up by rear units after the attack bogged down. In the weeks following our attack, when strong enemy artillery fire was directed at the position, sections were evacuated frequently in order to reduce losses. Current infantry regulations allow a company commander on the defense to execute local retirements when subjected to heavy harassing fire. Attack of September 8th, 1915. On my return from leave, I got the 4th Company, which a few days later was to attack on the right flank of the regiment. I took over the company in a reserve position in the Charlotte Valley. After a personal reconnaissance of the assembly area and the terrain to be attacked. I held a few rehearsals in the Old Valley positions, and in this manner prepared the company to approach the tough job that lay ahead of them with complete confidence. I regretted that my command lasted only a few days, but I was too junior to be a permanent company commander. Before dawn on September 5th, my platoon moved up through the communication trenches in a confident mood. The position we took over from a company of the 123rd Grenadiers was being undermined by the French. At various places, we could clearly hear the incessant work of the hostile tunneling squads. We hoped that the enemy would not stop burrowing before the start of the attack. We preferred honest man-to-man fighting to being blown up into the air. 3 long days passed during which the moles beneath worked without interruption. At 0800 hours on the 8th of September, our heavy artillery and mortars opened fire on the enemy position, some 40 to 60 yards in front of us, with approximately the same number of guns and weight of metal that had been used in the barrage prior to the storming of Central. The French artillery of all calibers answered immediately, with strong fire against our positions. We huddled together in our flimsy 3- and 4-man dugouts, while this furious cannonade raged over our heads. The earth shook continuously under the violent impact of the shells, and a veritable rain of sod, splinters, and broken branches was falling on all sides. Husky Argonne oaks were uprooted and came crashing to the ground. We could now hear nothing of the French sappers. Could they have completed their work? From time to time, I dashed through the company sector to see how my men were faring. Now and again, I was knocked off my feet by the concussion of shells exploding near our lines. I peeked over the parapet in the direction of the enemy. Countless giant geysers were erupting from the surface. Geysers of earth, smoke, fascines, sod, sandbags, and timbers. Trees were toppling everywhere, and a pall of blue-gray smoke enveloped the enemy's rear area. The barrage was to last for 3 hours, an unspeakably long time for us lying in that bubbly cauldron. Finally, the watch hands reached 10:45. That is 10:45 a.m. Crouching, the 3 assault teams slipped from their dugouts and assembled at the start line. Watches were synchronized. As the bombardment lifted, we would go over the top exactly on the stroke of 1100 hours. The engineer squads and the ammunition and material carrying parties arrived, and I pointed out the squad objectives to each squad leader. These objectives were some 225 yards beyond the enemy line, and I impressed upon them that it was necessary to keep to their objective, and that the enemy elements of the company following us in second line would take care of any outside local resistance. The activities after the successful attack, the consolidation of the gains, the establishment of contact, and the blocking off of sectors were thoroughly discussed. Meanwhile, under a terrific concentration of fire, all types and calibers of shell were demolishing the hostile position. It was hard to imagine that anything remained alive when the gunners got through. 30 seconds more. The riflemen crouched in the craters ready to go. 10 seconds more. The last shells struck close ahead of us, and before the smoke cleared, our 3 assault teams rose noiselessly from their trenches and dashed for their objective on a front of some 280 yards. The attack moved through the smoke and noise of the battlefield with the same precision shown in the rehearsals of the past few days. A wonderful picture. Our men paid little attention to the crowds of fear-crazed French soldiers climbing out of the nearest positions with hands raised high, and merely pointed them towards our line of departure. The assault squads rushed forward towards their objectives, and the units following in the second line under the company first sergeant took care of the prisoners. I joined the assault team on the right. We reached forward past the enemy trenches, and in a few seconds reached our objective. Engineers, entrenching squads, and hand grenade squads followed, close on our heels, and up to this time no one had been hit. Our advance was without the usual accompaniment of cheers and shouts, and as a result of this silence, we took the French rear positions completely by surprise. These people were convinced that the jig was up, and they surrendered without offering any resistance. A machine gun opened up and forced us to take cover. We moved to the left down the trench and established contact with the center assault team, and a few minutes later we were in contact with our left unit and with the adjacent company, in brackets 2D, which would be second as well. So that would be the second company. Okay, here we have another picture that's been drawn, and it reads, Attack of September 8th, 1915. In it, you can see the German troops marked in white going up over the top and charging the French, and characters outlined in black, evidently the French, are holding their hands up in surrender. So yes, the German troops marked in white are conquering the French troops marked in black. And in behind, you can see the remains of the forest, which is pretty thoroughly burned out, and what looks to be smoke and dust clouds all over, and bursting shells overhead. We continue. We worked at fever pitch, consolidating our positions for defense, and in a very short time, the trenches leading towards the enemy were blocked off with sandbags and ammunition and grenade dumps, which had been established. The French artillery opened up on the area behind us in such volume that we were completely cut off from our jump-off position. French machine guns prevented any movement outside the newly won position, and we had no chance of immediate resupply. The French infantry counterattacked, but even though we had a field of fire hardly 100 yards in width, we had little difficulty in stopping them. Within the positions, violent hand grenade fights centered around the blocked-off trenches, but there, as elsewhere, the enemy made no gains. The terrain sloped gently towards the enemy, and our hand grenades reached further than his. During the attack, 5 men in one of the assault teams were put out of action by an improperly thrown grenade. Friendly fire incident again. French fire after we reached our objective caused a total of 3 dead and 15 wounded by the enemy. Wounded for the enemy. Supplies of all classes were our next problem. Ammunition, materiel, and provisions had to be brought across open terrain which was constantly swept by French machine guns and artillery fire. A communication trench back to the line of departure had to be dug, and we had to establish contact with the unit on our right. Upon my suggestion, the battalion commander decided to have 80 men from the reserve dig a 100-yard trench from our position back to the jump-off point. This work was placed under my direction. Our work was 50 yards from the French, so I ordered my materiel squads to bring up a large number of sandbags and steel shields. I had learned something from the French on June 30th. We started work at 2200 hours, that's 10 p.m., although the enemy was still restless and excited and kept up an almost continuous fire illuminated by rocket flares. To get the job done in a single night meant getting underway without delay. To start with, I ordered a 16-inch sandbag wall to be pushed out from each end of the still non-existent trench. To build this wall was hell, and we formed an endless human chain with men flat on his back, and in this way we got the bags out to the wall builder. Hostile small arms had no effect on the men behind the bags, and in no time the wall stuck out into open space for a distance of 50 feet on each end. Then the supply of sandbags gave out, leaving a gap 200 feet wide. I chose this gap by having men take their armored shields into this gap and form a skirmish line. I closed this gap by having the men take their armored shields into the gap and form a skirmish line. As soon as the individual soldier got to his position, he emplaced the steel shield and began to dig in. Behind it, Rifle and hand grenades were at hand. This whole movement was accomplished without noise, although the enemy fired numerous flares and used all his infantry weapons. The only thing that reached us was rifle fire, and that could not penetrate our armored shields. Even so, the skirmish line was none too comfortable. At daybreak on September 9th, we had a communications trench 6 feet deep leading back to our old position. In the course of the night's work, we discovered the corpse of a 1st Battalion soldier which had lain in the no-man's land since June 30th. Just as I hit the hay after a hard day's work, the battalion commander and hard on his heels, the regimental commander, arrived to inspect the new positions. They were pleased with the success of the 9th and 2nd Companies. The assigned objective had been seized. Some officers, 140 enlisted men, 16 trench mortars, 2 machine guns, 2 drilling machines, and 1 electric motor were in our hands. The joy of the 4th Company over the success was dampened by the death of Reserve Lieutenant Stowe, our liaison officer with the 123rd Grenadiers, who had leave orders in his pocket. Shortly after the attack, I gave up the 4th Company again and, for a few weeks, took over the 2nd Company. It was with a heavy heart that I took leave of the 4th Company, where I had had such an excellent understanding with the troops. In command of the 2nd Company, I spent some time in the Crown Prince Fort, a shell-proof shelter and blocking position 160 yards behind the front line. While there, I was promoted to 1st Lieutenant and transferred to a mountain outfit which was to be activated in Munsingen. It was hard to cleave a fighting regiment in whose ranks I had fought through so many a hard day, and to say goodbye to the many gallant soldiers and to the blood-soaked, hotly contested soils of the Argonne. The Champagne battle was at its peak when, towards the end of September, I left the Binarville forest. Observations. With the newly acquired company, the attack for September 9th was thoroughly rehearsed. The 3 assault squads were to advance as soon as the artillery preparation ceased, traverse the nearby enemy positions without shooting, and capture the assigned objectives some 220 yards away. Mopping up operations were assigned the company units following in 2nd and 3rd lines. Contrary to my orders, 1 assault team used hand grenades during the advance and wounded 5 of our men. These were the only losses sustained in the attack proper. In principle, do not throw hand grenades during a charge, for our own people will run into them. The surprise achieved was complete. We were past the enemy forward position before he could grab a rifle, and our appearance at the entrance to his rear dugouts must have been regarded as Mephistophelian. The result was a relatively large number of prisoners. After the attack, we shifted swiftly to defense, this time by using the positions at hand, and we had no trouble at all in repulsing their counterattacks. Again, after the assault, the company communications to the rear were interrupted for hours by artillery and machine gun fire. The use of sandbags and armored shields greatly simplified the job of making contact with the rear. This ends Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Positional Warfare in the High Vosges, circa 1916, and War of Movement in Romania, 1916 to 1917, shall be included in the following video of this series. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.